Today, we're going to talk about how to turn a clinical question into a great research question. Most medical students know how to come up with a clinical question, but how can you turn that clinical question into a great research question that will set you up for a research project later on? Coming up with a great research question can be tricky, and I have thought a lot about this. As a medical student, I published 2 papers and spent 3 months doing research at Harvard Medical School. Today, I'll share some tips on how to turn a clinical question into a great research question. Let's get started. A great research question starts with an interesting clinical question. What do I mean by that? That means that you need to think about things that intrigue you as a medical student that you either see in clinic, in the hospital, or just around you as observing things in the healthcare medical setting. So what do you mean about that? Let's take an example, for instance, liver disease. Just for the sake of an example, you may say, I want to study people with liver disease and how being on a Mediterranean diet can actually help. So this is not a very good research question. But now, a better research question is, maybe you thought about people with liver disease and you've seen them in the clinic, in the hospital, in the medical care setting, and you've noticed that these individuals actually live far away from great sources of good quality food, either by talking to them or by knowing that from the medical chart. So a better research question might be, for individuals with liver disease, how does changing into a Mediterranean diet can lead to better outcomes? And this is just an example. So think of things that you see in the clinic, in the hospital, that may turn into interesting research questions. What are problems that frustrate you? And what are potential solutions that you may think about that you could potentially test this into a research project? The next advice is actually focusing down the clinical question into a better research question. So what do I mean by that? Narrowing down to certain populations, or into a policy, or into a certain specific part of the disease process that you can focus on. Going back to our example, if you think about liver disease, you may think about, for a certain population, either older individuals or individuals with alcohol use disorder who ended up having chronic liver disease. Or you may think about a certain policy question, such as how the Affordable Care Act can influence the care that these individuals with chronic liver disease receive. The second advice is actually to get those research ideas that you've narrowed down into a certain population, disease process, or policy, and you're going to write down as many of those related ideas as you can. Now, we're not trying to go for quality here, we're just going for quantity. So you can write down as many ideas as you can think of. And this is going back to the things you have observed in your clinical experience. So what are some things that actually frustrate you about this and how you can incorporate into your research idea? Again, we're not trying to go for quality here just yet. We're going for quantity. And this is important because we're trying to brainstorm here and trying to think a little bit about not just that specific question that maybe we set out to think about, but we're trying to expand here and think about many possibilities of what our research question may turn into. And this is very important because if we can expand this, we may come up with a much better research question than we initially wanted to if we just started off with a very narrowed focus research question right off the bat. The next thing to think about is actually something that I'm borrowing from my wife and what she explained it to me as I was getting started with research. One thing to think about is the formula, how does X affect Y among an X population? And what do I mean by that? So you're going to go back through the list of ideas that you wrote down in the previous advice, and you're going to think about how you can turn those ideas into this following formula. How does X affect Y among a Z population? So this means that you're going to mold your research ideas into a very basic research question. So going back to our example, you can think about something along these lines. How does a Mediterranean diet affect the quality of life among people with chronic liver disease? So you see how this turns your research idea about working with people with chronic liver disease in a Mediterranean diet into a research question type of format. So now you were going to go through each of the research ideas that you wrote down in the previous step, and you're going to do something similar to all of them. The next step is very important, and this will be going over these potential research questions with a research mentor. And this will be a reiterative process where you can talk about with your research mentor, explain some of your rationale, and then this mentor can actually provide you with some feedback and also on how to improve on which ideas are actually not feasible to do. So this step is very important. And this is where the actual improvement can come in your research question. There will be a certain degree of refinement here as you discuss with your mentor these potential research ideas. Now, you are going to get those research questions that you've talked about with your research mentor, and then you're going to take a look at each of them and now narrow down to which of the questions have the best potential for three things. The first one, is this something innovative? Something that people haven't really looked at. So this is the strongest type of question. The second one is this a more definitive type of research question? Have other people researched this, and in your research project, are you going to actually show that there is a definitive answer to this clinical question? And then the third one is this potentially the best paper that will come out of this topic? Meaning, are there innovative methods? Is there an innovative population? Is there something new that actually, or maybe other folks have actually written about this, but you were going to bring in a very different perspective, and that this will actually turn out to be the best paper on the topic? This step is very important, so you can actually think about which of the questions that you have already selected and discussed with your mentor, the ones that have the potential to be very impactful. Even as you're starting off, it may be best to think about the research questions that have the highest potential for impact. Now that you have turned your clinical question into a great, focused, potentially very impactful research question, now is the time to operationalize it. And we're going to talk about these steps in a future video. But now you're actually getting ready to think about the data sources, how to actually put this question into the test, and starting to answer some of these research questions that you set out to look at. So to summarize, this is how I transform a clinical question into a great research question. The first thing is actually to think about certain problems that actually frustrate you or that you want to improve on in your experience in the clinical setting. The second one is actually to focus down your clinical question. The third one is actually to write down as many ideas related to this topic as you can think of. Again, you're not going for quality, you're going for quantity. The next step is actually to use the formula that I told you, how does X affect Y among Z? So this will actually start to mold the research question from just a research idea. And the next, you're going to talk over with these research ideas with your research mentor and get some feedback, going through an iterative process on how to improve and maybe even come up with new research questions at that point. Then you're going to go over those research questions that you've selected and think about what are some of the most impactful ones that you can spend your time on. Your time is limited, so you want to make sure that you're using that to its best potential. Going through these 5 points will actually significantly help the chances that you'll be able to turn your clinical question into a great research question. See you next time.